All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD 1000 Web Development Technologies course, I'm doing a series of video presentations that are based off of the Mozilla Developer Network Learn Web Development series. I'm into accessibility, and we're working our way through this, and now we're up to the section HTML, a good basis for accessibility. A great deal of web content can be made accessible by just making sure the correct HTML elements are used for the correct purpose at all times, and that's what this article looks at. As you learn more about HTML, you'll keep seeing a common theme, the importance of using semantic HTML. All right. As it says, it means using the correct HTML elements for their intended purpose. One of the big things here, and I think this is what they're going to be getting into, but if you notice, div means division. So a lot of times in the past, people, instead of having a header section at the top of their web page, they would have a div with an ID of header or a div with a class of header. Normally it was an ID. The problem is divs don't have any semantic meaning by themselves. All right. And again, so that somebody with a reader for the blind would have a harder time discerning what a div was as opposed to a header section. All right, says, why is this even so important? All right, after all, you can use a combination of CSS and JavaScript to do just about anything, and there's the example. It says, but as you get into greater detail, it makes sense to use the correct element for the job. Not only do HTML buttons, in this case, have some suitable styling, they also have built-in keyboard functionality. Users, as mentioned, can navigate between buttons using a tab key and using other ways. Semantic HTML doesn't take longer to write than non-semantic or bad markup if you do it consistently from the get-go. Even better, it has other benefits, such as it makes your site easier to develop with. One that's not even mentioned in here, it makes you a better developer because you're developing it the right way to begin with. It works better on mobile, and it's good for search engine optimization. So let's take a look at some of these. It says we've already talked about the importance of proper semantics. Of course, out there on the web, the truth is that people do very strange things with HTML markup. All right. You probably heard the term hacks, a lot of HACKS, and that's a lot of times what people do. If they don't know how to do something or don't want to look it up or look it up and can't find out exactly what they want to do, they put their own little fix in there where they can make it work, but it can make it very hard for some people who could or would potentially use your site. All right. It says out there on the web, legacy, especially legacy sites that have not been completely forgotten. All right. Sometimes people just ignorantly didn't do something. They maybe didn't mean to. They just didn't do it. It says that when possible, you should replace such bad code. Sometimes you might not be able to. I know years ago, and some of you watching this tape may have already heard me tell this story, but I was working at AT&T Bell Laboratories back in the 1980s before they had their breakup. And I remember one of my first assignments, my boss gave me some code to work on, and he said, Jeff, there's about 10 errors in here. We want you to fix these errors. Well, it was a good way to learn the language, the C programming language that they use there as well. And I fixed the errors, but I noticed that when I ran the program, it had hundreds of warnings. All right. And I asked him, I said, I fixed the errors. Should I fix the warnings too? And he said, is it stopping it from working? I said, no. Is it stopping it from working correctly? And I said, no. And he said, then leave it alone. So I was not in the position to get rid of not lousy markup, but lousy code. The goal, as it says, there isn't all or nothing. Every improvement helps on the road. One of the best accessibility aids, as it says, is to have good content structure. So when you look at the example here, there's no text that exists in an island. It's either in a heading tag, a paragraph tag, an organized list, etc. So as it says, we prepared a version with longer text for you to try out with a screen reader. All right, and it's right there. if you try navigating through this, it says you'll see that it's pretty easy to navigate. The screen reader reads each header out as you progress your way through there. It stops after each element. You can jump to the next or previous heading. You can also go in and bring in a list of headings. But as it says there, sometimes people write headings, etc., and line breaks and do things like are shown there. In other words, it may look the same to people who have no kind of impairment whatsoever on the screen, but other people might look at it and a sight reader is going to have a big problem with this for a lot of reasons. It didn't use tags, basically. It interspersed the CSS right inside of here, etc. So it says if you try out the longer one, which is right here, you're going to find, as they mentioned, you'll not have a good experience. The screen reader hasn't gotten anything to use as signposts. And there's other things, as they mention here too. It's harder to style the content using CSS or manipulate it with JavaScript. All right, the language you use can also affect accessibility. It says don't use overly complex language and don't use unnecessary jargon or slang. Another thing that kind of goes along with this, in fact, I guess it's down here, is be careful with acronyms. All right, because an acronym HTML, yeah, most people know it stands for Hypertext Markup Language. CSS, yeah, etc. I've seen JS for JavaScript, etc. Some of those make a lot of sense, but unless if you are creating something technical, and maybe people who look at your site don't have that degree of technical sophistication, putting in a lot of acronyms might be very hard for them to understand. Other things, don't use dashes if you can avoid it. All right, instead of writing this, write this. Expand abbreviations. With page layout, it says in the bad old days, people used to create page layouts using tables. They did everything with tables. So you can set up a layout just fine using tables. You can do that. It's not that it's quote necessarily wrong, but there are better ways of doing it. So as it says, if you try to navigate this using a screen reader, it'll probably tell you there's a table to be looked at, and it might not know a lot more. Now, this isn't done much anymore, but sometimes in legacy systems, it's still out there. So with what we just saw, you could replace it with this that looks basically the same, but it uses the semantic tags. In fact, I like this example right here. All right. All right. It says if you try our more modern structure example, the screen reader, it'll work better. Another thing worth considering when creating is the use of the HTML5 elements. I've already talked about this. Instead of divs all over the place, if something is in a header section, surround it with header tags. If a nav is in a header section, surround it with nav tags. Or if the nav is in an island by itself. Same thing with footer, article, section, etc. Even the good use of figure caption tags, etc. All right. UI controls. By UI controls, the author says we mean the main parts of web documents that the users interact with, the buttons, the links, etc. One aspect, as it says, is by default, browsers allow them to be manipulated by the keyboard. All right. And then you can press enter or return. And there's a lot of people who like to navigate their way around. One thing I have students do when they're in the AWD 1100 C# programming fundamentals class is one of the things I harp on from the get-go when we start creating GUI or graphical user interface applications is to set the tab order, because there are people who like to tab their way through things. All right. And it says you essentially can get this kind of for free if you use the appropriate elements. All right. Building keyboard accessibility in says adding such advantages, yeah, it might take a bit of work. All right. But it's worth it. It really and truly is worth it from the get-go to do things. All right. to set things up with a tab order from the beginning, for example, just to do things with what we would call the right way. All right, I'm going to see if I can finish this in one tape here. So, meaningful text labels. All right, and you can see these here. These aren't. All right. And we've talked about some of this stuff already. Find out more about whales. That's not bad. Click here. That's bad. Don't do that. All right. Again, notice there's an accessibility label testing from Mozilla. Never looked at it. Basic data table with simple markup is shown here. It says it has problems. There's no way for a screen reader basically to iterate its way through there. All right. It says now have a look. Well, here's the bad table. All right. And here's the punk bands table example. We may have looked at that before, I think. I'm not going to even run through that. But it says there, table headers have been defined using the TH. There's a caption, etc. You're making it easier for people with any kind of impairment to use. And as we mentioned, as an added benefit, it also makes it easier for people on smaller mobile devices typically. Whereas textual content is inherently accessible, the same cannot be said typically for multimedia content, images, videos, etc. It says we've got a simple page here with accessible image. We've seen this one before. All right. It says the first image when viewed by a screen reader doesn't offer much help. It simply reads out this. All right. And it says there, this is why you should never include text content inside of an image. Screen readers can't access it. There are other disadvantages too, like copy and paste. We've talked about with images, it's now considered mandatory to put an alt tag in there. That alt tag, as I've mentioned in earlier lectures, is used twofold. Number one, if the system can't find the image it's looking for, it'll instead show the text, the alternative text, which is what alt stands for, of course. And second, if somebody has got, for example, a browser for the blind, it'll read that alt tag out to them. All right. Other text alternative mechanisms. Notice it says there is a long DESC or a long description attribute that is meant to point to a separate web document with a bigger description. Is that important? Again, it depends on what your site is and what you're trying to do with it. If ideally you're trying to reach everybody and that's a way that you can help do that, that's nothing but a good thing. All right. We talked, I just mentioned earlier about fig and fig caption, about that's a good thing. All right. Empty alt attributes. Now, there are occasions when you might want to have empty alt attributes. And that's if you've got an image that's decorative. So for instance, if it's not a logo, but you, for whatever reason, decide to put like a little picture of a flower in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. And it's not going to really help that a screen reader reads it because there's nothing really to say about it. Well, then, for example, you may want to just have an empty alt tag. That's not the greatest of examples, but I guess you get hopefully you get the idea. All right. Links we've already talked about. Styling says by default links are different. Be real careful when you use coloring, especially if you decide, well, you know what, I want links that have not been visited yet to be pink and not underlined. You can do that. But one thing about that is if you are going to do that, be consistent, all right, with the way that you do it. Okay, on-click events. Anchor tags, as it says, are often abused with the on-click event to create pseudo buttons. So in other words, you want to make a link look like a button by setting href to £, or JavaScript void 0 to prevent the page from refreshing. So again, there are things that you can do. That doesn't necessarily mean that you should do them. How's that? As it says, it can cause unexpected behavior. External links, remember, always use the target equal blank unless you're referring to something in your own document. even if it's your own web, even if it's another page or whatever in your document, have it be a target. Well, then I guess you could make the case, but don't ever, for instance, if I was going to if I was creating my own website and I was going to link back to Rankin Technical College, that should always be open in a target equal underscore blank. All right. All right. A skip link, as it says, is an element placed as close as possible to the opening body element that acts as the beginning of the page's main content. Skip links are especially useful for people who navigate with the aid of assistive technology such as voice control, something, again, you might want to look at. Proximity, large amounts of interactive content placed in close visual proximity should have a space inserted to separate them. All right, so that's just a few things. So we've looked at what is accessibility. We've looked at a good basis or HTML, and now it's time to go into CSS and JavaScript and continue this discussion.